Okay. Good morning for everyone that has joined us so far. We are just letting everyone get into the webinar, so just give us a minute or two and we'll get started. Perfect, and that is exactly on the hour. So good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to everyone joining us for the 10 Pitfalls Are Back webinar. We're really excited to get the new research kicked off with this webinar today. But before we do, just a couple of housekeeping rules, housekeeping items. Firstly, we do want the webinar to be as interactive as possible. So please add your questions to the Q&A section. There is also a chat function that you can use to make any comments or communicate with our panelists that we have today. We will also be sending you through an email with both the deck as well as the recording after the webinar has finished during this week. To get us started, the 10 Pitfalls research has been such iconic research by World Commerce and Contracting, and we're so excited that it's being really looked at and to kind of get that all started, we have Tim Cummins, President of World Commerce and Contracting, as well as Anurag Malik, CTO from ContractPod AI, to discuss it. And with that, I want to give over to Tim.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and what a fascinating topic. I guess the key point here, Anurag, is I don't know about the 10 pitfalls being back. I don't think they ever really went away, did they?
No, I agree. I don't think they ever went away, although we've seen a very different world, Tim, in the last year and a half because of COVID and people getting distance. But I think it's only actually put more focus on the pitfalls, if anything.
So today we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about what's the status that we know about those 10 pitfalls. And of course, in the interim, during COVID, we've been doing a lot of research. We've looked at the friction points in contracting, which of course often coincide with a lot of these pitfalls. We've also done an extensive benchmark study, which has given us some fascinating insights in things like cycle times and how workload is changing, etc. So we've got a lot of fresh, relevant detail. But of course, what we're doing this time, a couple of things that I think are quite distinct. One, this is just the kickoff of an updated study of is the 9.2% that we talked about back in 2014, I think it was now, is that still valid and relevant? Has it changed up or down? But more important, and the reason I'm really excited doing this with you is because I'm not a technologist. I believe in technology, and I'm convinced that machine learning, artificial intelligence, natural language processing can really be a game changer for our community, both in terms of our ability to demonstrate our skills, if you like, at reducing that value erosion, but more importantly, I think the extent to which technology can free us up to doing some things of far greater strategic value to the organization. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation with you to better understand from a technology expert what really is the art of the possible.
Absolutely, Tim. Likewise, really looking forward to actually jumping into the pitfalls and really delving into what exactly causes the pitfalls. Right? I strongly believe, despite being a technologist, that it's a very unique combination of people, process, and the technology coming together, which would actually lead us to a world which is which sees less of erosion in contracts and more value saved when it comes to enterprises.
Now, one of the things that's excited me, Anna, in recent times, and I suspect it will excited you too, I put up a blog a little while ago that reflected on the 22 years since ICCM, now World Commerce and Contracting, was incorporated, and how we were really beyond the founder corporations. We were very much a voice in the wilderness. People just didn't get contracts and commercial management. They were activities that were undertaken, but often unconsciously, often seen as administrative. There was no body of knowledge. There was no professional community performing these sorts of roles. And while senior management probably nodded in lip service to contracts, they really didn't take them that seriously, and they often viewed them as essentially legal instruments. And one of the exciting things for me has been, at long last, the broader recognition and appreciation that actually contracts and contracting is a fundamental business competency. And of course, it's only really been with technology, and particularly the research we've been able to do in our global community, that a lot of the truth about contracts and contract management has really started to come to light. And of course, we see here that while it was ICCM who first tried to really put a coherent value around the cost of poor contracting, others have started to jump on the bandwagon. And certainly in our early days, people like McKinsey and the big consultants and Gartner and others were just completely dismissive of our message. Being obviously personally gratified to see how they are not only now reproducing and amplifying that message, but of course, in many cases, building groups, teams that can actually work with corporations to really drive improvement. And I'm sure you've seen that very real change in the time that you've been involved with this field.
Absolutely, Tim. Isn't it amazing that all the value of any enterprise lies in its contracts, right? If you're on the buy side, of course, it's expense. And if you're on the sell side, it's the revenue coming in. But despite that, contracting is kind of treated as something which is very legal centric. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, legal things, it's job done when the contract is done, and there's very little handover from the legal teams to the implementation teams. And by the time the contract really things get into action, everybody has forgotten about what the terms in the contract are. And essentially, we are not seeing a very critical piece, which is information flowing to different stakeholders and making sure everybody understands what it is that they are responsible for and what their obligations are. It is so important to recognize that the birth of any big thing is the inception of the contract, and it really defines how things will move forward. So yes, I think COVID has in many ways kind of shown us that, hey, while we are working remote, there are things technology can do to help in many different things, contracting being one of them, actually. And like I said before, right, it is a combination of people, process, and technology, and technology can benefit a lot, but the processes have to change too, and people's mindset and holistic thinking has to change around how we treat contracts.
And of course, as Rod has observed in the chat, essentially try and sell a business if you don't have any contracts, and you begin to appreciate just how valuable an asset they actually are. Yeah, so interesting that being such a valuable asset, their history has not been one of good management. And of course, the pitfalls really did reveal that. And to your point about the role of legal, clearly they are a critical stakeholder in this overall process. But when we look at the pitfalls, in the majority of them, the legal department has marginal and perhaps even no involvement or engagement. So the idea that legal are in some way the owners of contracting as a process has, regularly, I guess, been shown to be one of the problems that actually our research shows that typically, if the legal function is leading on a systems implementation, it doesn't gain widespread adoption because they're predominantly thinking about how they drive greater efficiency for the legal function, not for the business.
Completely agree. Actually, legal is really a facilitator when it comes to the contracting process, right? It is the stakeholders who should be equally involved from the very definition of the contract, and legal should help kind of guide them in a way that they can avoid any pitfalls and failures and obligations which would actually put them at risk. But it is very important that we see that legal is just the facilitator and the first step when it comes to the contracting process. And it's actually the implementers, the folks who have to live through the obligations of the contract through its life, understand what's inside the contract, and in a lot of ways, actually, systems can simplify that, right? I mean, so many times we see outdated templates being used to generate contracts with languages which are overly complicated. That's where technology can come in and actually simplify what's in the contract to what is the goal for business, right? And many ways now, AI has kind of taken a lead in simplifying things for us and actually looking through noise and finding those things that have worked for an enterprise in the past, and making sure when a use case comes in with certain characteristics, then you're able to put together language and terms which have worked for you in the past.
So let's continue on our journey. Let's start to look at the pitfalls and start to talk about ways that they can be addressed more effectively and where perhaps their status is today.
The 10 pitfalls. World Commerce and Contracting's widely cited research on contract value erosion is back. Have the combined impact of the pandemic and new technologies altered the pitfalls that historically undermined contract value, or have increased levels of risk and market complexity made things worse? Now 7 years on, we ask, what can AI do to reduce or eliminate that famous 9.2%? So let's take a look at the pitfalls. Lack of clear or mutually agreed scope and goals. Contracts and legal team involved late. Failure to engage or consider stakeholders. Protracted negotiations. Contract terms and negotiations focus on risk allocation. Contract terms inflexible and fail to establish relationship governance. Contracts difficult to use or understand. Poor handover from deal team to implementation team. Limited use of contract technology and fragmented data. Weak post-award process governance. Don't miss our forthcoming release of World CC's jointly developed report with ContractPod AI. We'll take a closer look at the individual pitfalls and clarify the way that technology, especially AI, can be applied to reduce and remediate the economic impact of value erosion.
All right. Well, I think we've got a quick poll, actually. We would be interested in the audience's view of, we picked out 5 pitfalls that, in our view, are probably the most significant for many organizations. And we'd like to know, in the context of your experience in your organization, which of these 5 do you think is perhaps the biggest impact of all? Because And it is interesting, isn't it? Because I think while it is important to consider the application of technology to an integrated process, so we do need to think very much these days about before we start implementing technology, we really do need to make sure that we've got coherence in the process. But of course, once we've developed that coherence, very often the rollout of any technology is going to be phased. So there will often be particular focal points where we try and drive early wins. Is that your experience?
It is. It absolutely is. You know, so many times we just think that technology is going to come in and solve all our problems. Technology can assist, but it's not going to fix everything for you. And I think, just like I said in my previous point, just changing those mindset and approaching contracts or any process for that matter in a holistic manner can go a long way. And I don't want to bias the poll, but I have strong feelings on one of these, and which we'll dive into, I'm pretty sure. But I think making sure all the parties are involved from the get-go and have visibility absolutely goes a long way.
Of course, I think that makes a good point, which reflects in a way what you said before, Henrik, which, you know, that last point E, very often when you've got disaggregated pre-award and post-award activity, it's very easy for that pre-award team to say, well, it was all perfect when I left my office. So, and of course, we've done a lot of research that has really rather disproven that often, of course, organizations may not have made the investments they need in skilling up, creating capability, building tools, etc., to support post-awards. So certainly there are actions needed there, but very often the fault lines are embedded in the contracts we prepare. So interesting here, 44% lack of clarity on scope of goals, followed by that post-award. So does that surprise you as a result?
No, I'm not surprised at all, actually. I think the first two and the last one usually are the major reason for failed contracts and implementation. So not surprised. Yeah.
And of course, we've asked this in the sense of which of the pitfalls currently do this. And of course, it's interesting, only 2% are saying that limited use of contract technology is a problem. But of course, everybody's right in the sense that if we don't improve and correct in the other areas, then just sticking technology on the top of it, which far too many organizations have done, is just actually throwing good money after bad.
Absolutely. I mean, if you don't have everybody aligned and the processes in place, technology cannot make a difference. But that said, if you have everybody aligned and the processes and people in place, technology can actually give you a very strong edge and make a real difference. And so many times we see, like you said, Tim, there's the systems implemented, but they are implemented in silos. And they're limited to one group. They do not kind of talk to other systems within the enterprise. Remember, there's ERP systems, there's CRMs, etc., which hold a lot of actually the outcomes of what goes in contracts, right? I mean, for example, the ERP system holds the performance of what's actually stated in the contract, right? And being able to compare that with what's in the contract would give a vendor management office a much more better edge over their supplier's performance. And similarly, empowering our sales folks to generate contracts with just one click would be so much more meaningful if the CRMs, CLMs of today spoke to the different systems which form an organization. So technology implementation and how you fit in with the bigger organization was a very long way. And for that to happen, I think a lot of alignment needs to happen, especially when you're getting legal tech in, right? Remember, legal tech lags. You're not going to have a company typically implement a contract lifecycle management system unless they have some kind of ERP and CRM in place, right? So legal tech does lag, and if you put it in silo, it's not going to go very far. So I'm not actually surprised on the limited use of contract technology. I think the others can get you a long way, but to get to the final mile, you have to make sure you have technology which can make you more efficient and get things done faster. And really, technology can improve the process in many ways too. And we can, when we talk about some of the pitfalls, I think it'll become apparent how technology can offer solutions.
Yeah, and some of our audience have heard this before. We've mentioned it in a few of our reports, but certainly we see the members who are at the front of the game here are really thinking much more about contract data management than they are about contract lifecycle management. So of course they're thinking about data movement across that lifecycle and how do we simplify and give greater access to that data. Our research again showed that on average, contract-related data, to the point you're making, sits in 24 different systems. And that, of course, is why very often there's a pushback against, oh my God, yet another system coming in. So unless we're embedding systems that actually simplify those data flows and reduce the workload of data entry and data extraction, then we are inevitably going to get many of those stakeholders saying, no thanks.
Absolutely.
So let's just look. First of all, I think, you know, we know that the pitfalls in and of themselves, the places where, if you like, there is this potential for value erosion, really haven't altered. So I think we wanted to have a quick trawl through these and just comment on them. Now, our audience, of course, chose that pitfall. Number one was their favorite one. Interesting that, because we've seen in our benchmark studies over the last close to 20 years now, we've seen an interesting sort of, I don't know, it's a bell curve, I suppose, almost, or an inverted bell curve. In the olden days, back in the early 2000s, procurement, legal, less legal perhaps, but certainly procurement and sales contract experts very often did engage with the definition of scope, ensuring that, you know, clarity of requirement and an alignment with capability on the sales side, and were actively involved in the production of things like statements of work, either in terms of supporting their drafting or certainly in terms of the percentage where they undertook review. As the years went by, and I think as pressure on these groups grew in terms of workload, but also, of course, the frequency, particularly of services and solutions contracts, so the volume of statements of work and service level agreements has increased dramatically over the last 20 years without anybody really thinking about the workload implications of improving it. So steadily we saw the percentage that got some level of review dropping from over 70% back in around 2003 to a low of only just over 20% by sort of the period 2015, 2016. For the first time in the pandemic, we've actually seen that shifting. And the percentage that is getting reviewed, and sorry, I should have checked this number, but from memory, I think is back up nearly 40%. So I guess good news and bad news, recognition of the problem, growing attention being paid to it, but by and large, still fairly manual attention and limited activity to try and draw and standardize scopes of work, statements of work, still very often left with project managers, engineers, or others to pull it together. What can AI do for us there, Anurag?
You know, I mean, just touching on our first pitfall here, right? When we say lack of clarity on scope and goals, what's really happening here, Tim, is again, we are leaving the contracting process to only legal, who, just like you said, is kind of bottlenecked when it comes to the amount of contracts and deals that come their way. And the reason being, the rest of the world has moved on, right? A lot of automation has happened, and legal is still using at times, not always, certain set of templates and things, right? I mean, certain containers which they think will fit in everything, and if when contracts are done that way, one, the stake holders have little input because they think it's a legal job to get the contract done, and two, the handover that happens between legal and actual implementation teams and folks who have to live through the lives of the contract is very poor most of the time, because legal's overworked. They don't have things which will make their life easier and more efficient. And when I think of technology, I think of it as an enabler to make legal more efficient. It's not something that replaces. AI in no way replaces our lawyers, but AI can help to mundane work, right? Things which are really repetitive, time consuming, that kind of work AI can take over and make it more, really have our lawyers kind of focus on something more strategic, rather than review hundreds and hundreds of contracts, right? The other thing which I've seen really helps from a system perspective is well-defined workflows and approval processes, which are really not even AI. I mean, you have tons of automation tools out there which can do that. And what that does is it can put in checkpoints for the right stakeholders, for them to pitch in, for them to get visibility, right? Instead of people looking away and waiting for the contract to be done and then jumping in, they would be involved from the get-go. And really, the problem we're trying to solve here is loss of information to go away, right? You want to make sure information flows both ways, from our stakeholders to legal and from legal to stakeholders. And this is where a system can help and facilitate that. Again, the mindsets have to change, right? I mean, people, you can install a CLM and folks could still go email legal out of the system and say, hey, can you look at this, right? So it's a combination. There's a certain amount of discipline needed, but we certainly have the tools today to get our legal teams more efficient, so that they're at par with the rest of the organization, which has been using a lot of automation and to some extent AI for a long time now.
Lovely comments in the chat, Stuart. I'd love to know how many chocolate teapots you've actually managed to acquire. So, yeah, I mean, I think the exciting stuff I'm seeing in the statement of work area is much more intelligence being applied now. There are opportunities to standardize, very much like we can have standard terms, standardized fallbacks agreed, etc., and start building those into AI-powered systems. Just the same applies with scope of work, where we can begin to have models. And the set of terms that we want is very much driven actually by the pricing or charging model we choose. And far too often we see a lot of problems with scope being that the business unit doesn't really want to address the challenge of what is the right pricing or charging model. Far easier for me to just agree if I'm a buyer, let's just agree time and materials, rather than actually get into the discipline of really trying to nail down the requirement, the capability, and the true likely cost. So we are starting to see much more front-end discipline. And of course, again, by taking that AI out into the business, the ability to ask intelligent questions of the business unit to really get early warning and early understanding of what the true requirement is and what the true capability need is going to be, so that we can have, and this really goes to point 2 as well, we can start to inject appropriate legal or commercial or contract management resource much earlier in the process, because if it's a risky deal, they can actually receive very early warning of that issue. And those two we see being very much tied together, as indeed it is to number 3, Anurag, where this issue of stakeholder engagement, you know, when it was in a manual process and we're just having to forward stuff around, often sequential rather than occurring in parallel, that's changing fast, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Folks are overworked, right? I mean, there's no doubt about that. There's time pressures, and nobody really thinks that, hey, it's my problem to tell the other person, right? They just think that, hey, I need this. I'm going to hand it over to legal. Legal will do the negotiations. And they'll come back when the deal is done. But really the essence is, you know, because there is enough opportunity with automation to somehow to make information available, right? If you put a system, so let's take 2 scenarios, Tim. There is an organization which does not have, let's say, a CLM, right? And there's an organization which does have a CLM. The one which does have a CLM can make life easier for everybody by just laying out that, hey, this is the front door, legal front door. This is how requests go into legal. And then triggering obviously pre-approved and well-designed workflows, which is, hey, if it's a buy-side contract of certain value, then trigger these approvals, and these stakeholders should get visibility within the organization, right? If there are certain skill sets needed in the contract, which AI can pull, right? Then probably the CTO or the VP of engineering needs to get involved, and then depending on those, like the intricacies which go into forming the contract, the right stakeholders can be involved. Now, can we do this without a system? Yes, but we're talking about hours and hours of coordination just to get people's attention and get people in a room to go over these things, and not one time, many times, right? Because again, people are busy, they have their other priorities. But if you put in a system and process in place which would put roadblocks till you get the right input from all stakeholders, the probability of failure reduces big time, right? And yes, there are time pressures always there, and which will be there despite a system, but you're facilitating a process which otherwise would be ignored because they would not be on anybody's priority, and there'll be no checks and balances. So it's putting those checks and balances to make sure that the stakeholders are engaged, and that just goes a long way.
It certainly does. And you know, Paul makes an absolutely correct comment. Vague requirements can't ever be managed, no matter how good the process and the contract. And I think, Paul, it's partly an issue of vagueness, and it's partly an issue of the probability of change. You know, I think very often today, more or less inevitably, we face tremendous pressures for what we thought were requirements actually to change quite substantially over the life of the contract. And very often, again, we don't perhaps build and we compliment the governance mechanisms embedded in contracts. Very often we haven't really built the governance capability to manage change well, and to even identify, in fact, when it's occurring. Now, these first 3 points often in themselves tend to lead to some of these protracted negotiations, we are seeing quite a strong trend towards contract simplification, rethinking the design of contracts so that they're easier to understand. And certainly that is having a beneficial effect. I think if we can look at number 4 and 5 in a way in conjunction, because it's these two issues really that contribute to a lot of the cycle times that we see. And for the first time again in our 20 years of benchmarking, this year we have actually seen contract cycle times from bid to signature increasing. On average, they've increased by about 13%, which is very significant. Now, why? Well, we're seeing again some indicators of that. One is pure workload. The pandemic obviously created chaos. Many contracts had to be renegotiated, had to be adjusted. So I think our community here, buy side and sell side, has been overwhelmed by volume of work, and certainly that's what they tell us in the benchmark. But of course, it's here again that if you had an integrated system, and we do see a very real difference here between the organizations that really have got the life cycle being managed by a coherent system versus those that don't. If your workload is largely manual, then those cycle times increase particularly heavily. I think the other point here is that we are increasingly interested in the pandemic has led our community to talk much more about the need for greater collaboration. Yet many of our contracts remain very adversarial in nature. In other words, they take fairly extreme positions. And organizations, again, that are simplifying contracts, understanding the nature of the relationship better. And this, again, Anurag, is where technology can really help us with better segmentation of the relationships we need. And therefore, we've seen quite a marked move away from the rigid contract templates. And I think about 12% of the organizations that were responding to our benchmark study have now moved to AI-powered clause libraries with fallback terms that gives the negotiator much more empowerment and much greater flexibility. And they are seeing a real benefit in Pitfalls 4 and 5.
Couldn't agree more. Actually, contracts and legal language is hard for people who are not lawyers. And that's why a lot of folks shy away from it. And if we follow contracting processes which still use very rigid templates, like you said, Tim, they're not going to make anybody want to read them more than they wanted to read them before, right? So understanding what AI can do is two things. One is simplify some of these templates to match the use case, number one. Number two, which Tim, you rightly pointed out, there are tools now to review incoming third-party contracts, or even your own contract as it undergoes negotiations, and compare it against predefined playbooks to give it a risk score in terms of obligations, and taking that risk score and digitizing it and converting it into dashboards which the organization can understand beyond legal would really help stakeholders understand what's happening through a negotiation process. And we have online collaboration tools now, which both for internal and external negotiations and collaboration, which can really give folks the ability, even though they could be sitting in two different corners of the world, to work on documents together and in a collaborative fashion, with actually AI giving you results on, hey, did this change increase the risk or reduce the risk? And here's an alternate language which simplifies this legal language, even if you don't want to incorporate that in the contract itself. for somebody who's not a lawyer to get that alternate language, simplified language, so that they can relate to exactly what the contract is saying and whether it aligns with their business case, would really help. And actually does help. A number of organizations actually investing in contract lifecycle management has gone really high. And I'm not a lawyer, but I work very closely with a lot of them. And I think redlining and negotiations and contract reviews is a big part of what lawyers do, especially as they're negotiating contracts. So as much as we can smoothen that process for both legal and non-legal stakeholders, the more value or time to market, I think we can save.
Yeah, I think, well, most legal departments, of course, are under pressure. Executives are pushing for more speed. Executives are pushing for better risk management rather than risk transfer, or perhaps getting stuck on traditional risk terms. So I think we're certainly seeing many GCs that we work with at the OCC really wanting to drive quite substantial change in this area. And, you know, there is that need to redefine the role of legal within the business, and also greater pressure for them to be able to demonstrate, you know, if you look at the legal press, it's all about how does the legal department move from being a cost center to a profit center, conversation many of us are familiar with. But I think there is real pressure there. And I think there's a much greater receptivity on the part of senior legal counsel around the importance and the potential for change and improvement. Let's move to our next wave of pitfalls and try and move through those fairly rapidly. Because we did touch on this one, of course, Anurag, that the importance of flexibility in contracts is massively increased. I mean, COVID, unfortunately, when it hit, you know, people pulled out the contract in many cases, but there was just nothing in there that was helpful. We saw a great flurry of interest in force majeure, and in some cases that was used or threatened. But in general, people, of course, were not looking for the right to terminate their agreement. They actually wanted their agreement to continue. They just wanted rights to delay or rights of amendment. And contracts didn't really address that well, which is why I think so many in our community turned around and said, we actually need to start building more mechanisms to facilitate change and to support better governance of our contracts.
Absolutely. I think what COVID did is everybody's favorite clause was the force majeure one, right? And folks, suddenly it became one of the most important one. We've seen that especially from non-legal stakeholders, right? The stress is on the happy path. And anything that deviates from that is not thought through, and rightly so, because they're not thinking through those things. But imagine a legal department that, as at least in my experience, legal is always outnumbered by the number of folks they're supporting. And if the stakeholders are not thinking through all the use cases, it falls on a very overworked lawyer or lawyers to actually put in those contingencies. And that's where I think a system can help them in terms of not just pointing out playbooks and clause libraries and other governance that has worked for similar contracts in the past, but actually bringing it forward for stakeholders outside of legal too, and giving them visibility. By the way, these are the things which are typically involved with a contract which fits certain characteristics, and that could really kind of help bridge the gap there. And having the right input at the right time can help input those governance checks and give that flexibility.
I understood again makes the point that, it's commenting that BlackRock may use NEC for contracts, and absolutely right, Stuart. I mean, when we have standards, you can educate people on standards. So not only can you embed greater flexibility perhaps as a frame within those frameworks, but equally people can be educated on their use, on the terms within them, how to deploy and use those terms. One of the big problems that so many industries have, and of course it's even true in the engineering construction sector, because NEC contracts are used by some, predominantly UK, a little bit Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, they've been used in Hong Kong. You go to the US and nobody will know what you're talking about. You go to Europe and they're using FIDIC, which was actually an earlier version of NEC. And so, unfortunately, we don't always tend to get this splintering. We don't step back as a community and say, actually, how can we harmonize more? How can we make it easier for people to actually understand? How can we support intelligent systems by not trying to make their job as impossible by writing the same thing in a multitude of different ways with a multitude of different structures? We talk about that we want to manage risk better, but then we produce frameworks that are, for the majority of users, incomprehensible. So that again is something that's changing, and technology is also helping us on that journey, because of course with things like natural language processing and so on, we are able to identify whether things are really different or whether they're superficially different. And this, of course, is also giving us the opportunity to look at contract portfolios, not just individual transactions. We're beginning to be able to monitor things at a very different level, which then is beginning to help us, I think, with this handover, isn't it, from deal team to implementation team. So back to Rod's earlier observation of, it was perfect when it left my office, but the implementation team messed it up. But now we can begin to do things like obligation extraction and dissemination and the monitoring of performance on obligations. That's an exciting development for us, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The deal teams and the implementation teams really talk, right? And it's job done when the signature is done. But you brought in a very good point about the ability to break down the contract and extract obligations, right? Things which folks are responsible for, or the post-active contract life cycle, which is really the majority of the life cycle of the contract, right? Remember, from the point of thinking about a project to signature is probably a very small fraction of the actual life of the contract. So breaking down those obligations for non-legal stakeholders to understand them, and so because those are the guys who are responsible for those obligations, and they would only go to legal in case of trouble, right? Because legal is done when the contract is signed for good reason, because they have to move on to the next one. But what AI does is really take those complex clauses and break it down into English obligations, right? Which a non-legal background person can understand. Really facilitates things. And I do want to bring one more point, which is we've talked a lot about CLMs and contract lifecycle management systems. And I have experience, including at home, with somebody who's not a technologist, but needs technology in her day-to-day life. And every time we talk about technology, there is resistance and there is the fear of, oh my God, how complicated is it going to be for me to use the system? The good thing is there's enough CLM has gone through the last 8 to 10 years through enough number of cycles to get that feedback from from legal users, from non-technology users, to come up with systems that are really user-friendly, take away all ambiguity, not complex to use. They're not complex like an ERP system, right? There are three things you can do with a contract. You can author it. Just to put things in a simple way, you can review a third-party contract, or you can actually terminate or amend a contract. And what I've started to see now is systems are making it that simple, so that anybody who has not spent a lot of time working with systems can now jump in and pick it up in a few days. And that is the essence, right? We have to break that barrier of the perception that any system will have a huge learning curve and will not work the way it is supposed to work. But remember, we're living in the day and age of iPhones, where when you get your iPhone, it takes 5 minutes to set it up, and no help is generally needed, right? Yeah. That is the thought process that is now I've started seeing going into systems which are more modern, which can really help legal teams get up and running in less than a week, and that's what you want. And the advantage is there's some of these, especially the what we're looking at the last few pitfalls, which really points to me that information is not flowing within the organization, right? And a lot of it, including not involving stakeholders or lack of clarity of goals, does go away when information flows. And you do, at the end of the day, you do need a well-organized system to make sure information flows at scale.
Yes, I think to sum it up, certainly we are observing where there are good information flows, then of course organizations can begin to better understand the opportunities to reduce value erosion, or indeed to drive revenue growth and revenue improvement. Without those data flows, we're all operating to a varying degree of blindness. And of course, with that blindness comes our inability then to really make the business case to senior management for change. And, you know, we therefore finish up back in this cycle of, oh, change is risky, and we can't really disprove it. So, you know, we are seeing the emergence, I think, of a much more exciting time. And for those of you who haven't looked at this year's benchmark report, I think you'll find it really interesting, because the organizations that really are beginning to make progress in this area are fundamentally changing the nature of the measurements that they're applying to their commercial processes. They're beginning to be able to look much more at revenue opportunity that's generated, margin improvement, because they're able to, as I've said before, increasingly look not just at individual transactions, which is important, but also to look at portfolio impact. And they're able to start looking at the deals that succeed versus the deals that fail, and begin to really get focus in on a lot of these pitfalls. So we're seeing some big changes. And Anita, Anya, to your question, how easy is it to get legal departments to work within a CLM system's processes? I think the answer is it varies. We have to have the conversation. If we don't help legal to understand why this matters, then in a sense, we've also got ourselves to blame for that lack of change. But I think there are some very, very positive signs. That fact, as I said before, legal departments are recognizing that the old ways need to alter. Obviously here at World CC, with the extent we work with law schools now and teach at law schools, we're definitely seeing that hunger for greater knowledge and understanding of contracting in a bigger context. But, you know, just today, for example, I was reading about the law schools that are introducing mandatory coding for their law graduates. And actually, we're seeing graduate courses for legal operations to really get the legal community much more in tune with a lot of these fundamental business issues. And, so I mean, obviously some historically disappointing statistics up in front of us here, Anurag, with the fact that, there have been some 60% of companies that have implemented software have actually failed to really roll it out. But given all that we've been discussing, that's not a great surprise. And 45% of the digital transformation projects undertaken to date haven't delivered the expected ROI and profit. But again, our data tells us that's not inevitable. We need to be aligning our digitization initiative with an understanding of the emergent technologies that can really make that a success. We have another quick poll for you, if we could. We'd like to know why, in your experience, there's been a lack of feature deployment when companies have invested in technology. Again, we know from our data, and I'm sure you see this all the time, high proportion of companies now have some form of automated repository. Probably a fairly high proportion have some form of automated document transfer, redlining, etc. But actually, beyond some of those basic functions of contract production, there hasn't been a whole lot of real improvement.
Completely agree. Yeah. I think there are systems which have the capability, but just the way they're implemented, folks are using certain modules only. And again, right, if your contract lifecycle management system is not going to talk to other enterprise systems, it's not going to be very effective. And not surprisingly, poor integration across enterprise won this poll. I also think number 3, stakeholders not involved early enough, rightly came in as a second one, because that really puts a big dent into the whole project.
Yeah. So we come back to the point again that it's a team sport, and if we don't actually coordinate people, and if we don't have clarity over the value proposition, I mean, I think very often it's just this challenge of getting the different stakeholders to buy into the point that this is going to benefit everybody. And historically, probably this perception that the technology is going to impose controls and rigidity, and people get nervous about that. I need to be able to do deals. I need to be able to negotiate. What are you going to do to me here? Different divisions that say, oh, no, your contract standards are not the ones I can use in my particular division. So we get this internal contention, which is very often built around this perception, often driven by ERP systems, actually. The history and the experience of ERP for many has been imposed levels of rigidity. Modern contract management systems don't have to do that, do they?
Technology is only as good as people and process system. And I just read a comment on chat which said, hey, it's just not only the stakeholders, it's identifying the right stakeholders, which is so true, right? It's you are only as good as what your desire is, right? You can have the best system out there, but if you do not intend to or put in the effort, I mean, there are intentions, but with intention, I think comes the need for a very strong effort to make sure that the right people, all of them, and the right processes kind of come in as an input to the technology you're going to implement. You're not going to be successful. And you're not at least going to get 100% of what you intended to get. So I think technology is the easy piece here, as long as there's people and processes which are aligned to make it successful. What as a technologist, what's our responsibility is to make it simple to use, right? I think simplicity in terms of onboarding, in terms of implementation, in terms of actually usability, right, is very important, and that falls on us as technologists. But people and processes, I think that onus is something which organizations who are willing to invest in digital transformation have to think about and take very consciously.
And again, our benchmark shows us, and any another perhaps note of optimism here, certainly our benchmark tells us that the number one priority at the moment on the list for CCM teams, whether that's led by legal, by procurement, or a dedicated CCM function, is in fact improved process definition. So I think many organizations have got the point that this is a fragmented array of activities that has not been viewed as a process. They sit with multiple different owners, very often poorly defined, and their responsibilities poorly defined. Maybe we should just leave with, I'm sorry, anonymous attendee who asked our question at the beginning, way back at 4:15, least time here. Is there any advantage to insert change process into a contract for a customer when they can just get adjustments for free if there's no formal process? And I think I do understand that, and I think all of us who have been on the sell side have experienced that perhaps reluctance of customers often to be that well defined, because they do believe they can use pressure later on to get free changes. But on the other hand, I think we have to step back and evaluate the cost of that, the cost of the relationship, but also the cost of delay, of contention, and of, certainly the economists talk to us about shading, that actually people find ways to get revenge. Is that really the way we want to operate our business relationships and our contracts? I certainly hope not. And I think we're seeing a very new era coming as a result of COVID, with this appreciation that there's so much opportunity for improvement. We will shortly be coming back out with, is 9.2% still the average? How does that vary by different industries? Because of course there is substantial variation by industry. And indeed many people are joining some of the contract economics workshops we're running to really try and look and understand better where what their state of erosion is. And we will shortly be in fact issuing a health check tool, which will give anybody and everybody the opportunity to go in and start looking at questions of what level of value erosion am I experiencing. But Anurag, I think can say with a high degree of confidence that things have not actually moved for most people. They have not massively improved over the last 6 or 7 years, but for some they have, and for many there's now a big opportunity to make things a lot better.
Completely agree, Tim. Clear opportunity for sure.
Thank you so much for giving us your insights, intelligence on how technology could be deployed around these. And as we said at the beginning, this is the beginning of that particular journey. We continue to work together to look at this in more detail and depth. And thank you, obviously, to everyone in the audience who's been so active on chat and enabling us to answer the questions as we've moved along.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Tim.